Poly panel, the two that give it without any spin. I'm sure they'll deliver today. Liberal MP Jason Falinski from the Labor Party. Patrick Gorman, gentlemen, thanks both for your time today as ever. Why don't we begin with you, Patrick, on the WA border situation. An interesting weighing in here, Gladys Berejiklian on the GST, the New South Wales leader, saying we're going to have a hit to GST. That's going to happen, and it will be exacerbated by tough border stances. I mean, that's true, isn't it? It's all well and good to say, here's our tough border policy, but this has ramifications on the whole of Australia. We are one country.
Well, I completely agree we are one country. And I do love the skill of New South Wales politicians. I don't know where they learn this. It must be in your high school system, of being able to blame every other state for things that New South Wales sees as not going well in their state. I think she had a shot at the Victorians, she had a shot at the Western Australians. You know, I just find it's a peculiar thing about the New South Wales crew sometimes, that they seem to sort of think that if we don't follow their lead, then somehow we're doing the nation damage. Let's be honest about the tax receipts that Western Australia is chipping into the national pool right now. Our mining sector is one of the best performing sectors of the Australian economy, has been for many years, and has been able to continue without the impacts from COVID, partly because of that hard border. So I think Western Australia is doing some pretty heavy lifting when it comes to contributing to the national tax pool. And so you can talk about GST on the one hand, but
New South Wales doesn't have a hard border. Has its mining workforce been impacted by COVID-19?
Well, look, I'm a long way from the Hunter and other parts of New South Wales, but I'm just saying, like, it is the large amount of exports that come out of Western Australia. You know, we are the largest exporting state. That obviously has a huge impact in terms of the company tax revenue, income tax that Western Australians contribute, less on the GST front. But you know, I think we're doing our fair share, and the hard border has helped with that.
But you just said, well, the hard border is meaning that you know, the mines can stay open and all that valuable red dirt can be shipped off around the world. I mean, as I said, New South Wales doesn't have a hard border approach.
I look at
its mining sector doesn't seem affected.
Yeah, but if you look at the international comparisons, Western Australia versus Brazil, Brazil has had to shut down iron ore mines because of the coronavirus.
Why are you comparing it to Brazil, though?
Well, because it's the other large...
one of the Australia with a different policy on borders.
Well, because I'm talking about the large iron ore exports, which is the predominant export of Western Australia. I'm not going to comment about other mining sectors when the point I'm making is that our mining in Western Australia is helping contribute to the national tax pool. So I thought it was a bit of a cheap shot from the New South Wales Premier.
Yeah, and we'll let Brazil know you're not a fan. Jason Falinski, what are your thoughts on that? WA saying that they're propping up the nation now, do you agree?
Look, Tom, I think it's just incredibly disappointing, the behaviour of some of the premiers in Australia. When we need to be bringing Australia together, there are some premiers who seem to be more concerned about dividing Australia. There is no need for these hard borders. And when some people talk about compassion, I think what they really are talking about is that they are just enjoying the control.
Who's enjoying the control then?
Well, for example, you look at today's story in Queensland where Tom Hanks was allowed to come into Australia without very many conditions placed on his arrival in Australia, but at the same time, the family of a dying man in Brisbane has been denied the capacity to see their father in his last days. We've had example after example of mothers trying to see children, mothers whose children have been in need of medical help who've been redirected to Sydney instead of the closest hospital in Brisbane. We have 22,000 Australians trying to get back into Australia who are all having to come through Sydney because, quite frankly, the premiers of other states are refusing to lift their ludicrously low caps on international travellers who are just trying to get back to the country in which they live and their families are.
So on the power element, though, do you think Anastasia Palaszczuk, Mark McGowan, Peter Gutwein addicted to the power?
I think in the case of Peter Gutwein, for example, and obviously Daniel Andrews, they're simply following medical advice. There's very little medical advice that supports the policies in Queensland. As Peter Dutton has pointed out over and over again, where is this health advice to the Palaszczuk government's to the Palaszczuk government's policy when it comes to Western Australia. In fact, some of the messages from the Western Australian government have not been consistent. It's not consistent to say that within the bubble that we've created, this undiscovered land, if I can put it that way, that people can socialise without socially distancing because somehow it's safe in this bubble. As the Chief Medical Officer has pointed out, that's not a good message on health grounds to be saying.
Well, Patrick, what do you make of the quarantine issue? I mean, you mentioned WA doing its bit for the economy. It's not really pulling its weight compared to New South Wales on getting people back to Australia, is it?
Look, I do agree with Jason that having we heard last week 23,000 Australians overseas registered with DFAT who want to come home. We do need a national plan to get them all home. That is something that can only be coordinated federally. I think at the moment you've got Western Australia doing its share, but I do have a lot of compassion for those Australians abroad who, for some of them for months and months, have been saying they want to come home. They do have the right to come home. And I would like to see a bit more coordination across the National Cabinet. I do believe this is a national priority. They have an Australian passport, not a West Australian or New South Wales passport. And finding a way to get them all home, ideally all home by Christmas, in my view. Now, that's just what I feel, because must be very tough for people who have now been some months away from family. Although I do have to pull Jason up on using Peter Dutton as a model of transparency. We know time and time again that Peter Dutton does not run is not a believer in open and accountable government. And to sort of say, well, he should release, the Queensland Premier should release health advice, when we know time and time again that Peter Dutton has refused to act on the advice of health professionals about children in his care within his portfolios. I just don't think that is a particularly credible argument.
What about just the isolated question? Should the Queensland government, should the Victorian government, should they release this health advice, all the modelling, all the detail that means, as some of the examples are, you know, we're getting a dying father unable to see all of his children.
Oh, I find these stories like really hard, and it's the personal stories compared to the theoretical basis on which these decisions are made. It's a constant tension, and I don't think any politician can pretend that these aren't tough decisions. And some days I'm very glad that they're not decisions that I have to make. And I'll just say I do believe in transparent and accountable government. I know in Victoria, like, they've had an oversight committee. Federally, we have an oversight committee that actually reviews these things. I think the COVID oversight committee is meeting today. It meets a couple of times a week, I think. It's a pretty busy, active committee. I believe in transparency. I believe in accountable government.
All right. Where does this go, Jason Falinski, on borders? Do you think ultimately the federal government, because we don't know if the vaccine will happen, the parameters for reducing borders are very high for some of these states. Will the federal government have to really weigh up whether it's willing to either take court action or introduce legislation if it's for the good of the nation?
Well, I think, Tom, that's a great question. Ultimately, Australia was designed to be one. At the moment, it is being artificially divided. Now, in some cases, there are good health reasons for doing that, but that is more in the exception than the norm. We have New South Wales accepting more people every second day than all the other states combined. That's not acceptable. That is not a nation acting as one, and we should be acting together at a time of crisis. So, I mean, no one wants to see these decisions made in court. What I would argue is for some people to show political courage, to put aside the stick of popularity and do what is the right thing.
But should the federal government be willing to do that if necessary?
Well, look, Tom, those decisions will be made by others, but ultimately I think the Australian people will reach their own judgment in due course about some of the decisions that have been made by some of the premiers.
What's your view, though?
Well, my view is that when a dying man cannot see his children, that is not acceptable in Australia in the 21st century.
And on that border issue, though, on taking action, whether it be court or legislation?
Well, Tom, my view is that we should bring political pressure to bear to get Anastasia Palaszczuk to do the right thing.
Patrick Gorman, your thoughts before we wrap up?
Scott Morrison's just got to press the reset button. He's had a few months where he's kind of managed to offend too many premiers. I think he just needs to come out and say, let's start afresh. You know, it wasn't that long ago he was funding and supporting a court case with Clive Palmer. I mean, that didn't bring him any goodwill from Western Australia. I think he's said some things about the Victorian and Queensland premiers that he probably privately regrets. He should press the reset button and try again, start afresh, because if we do want to get that serious national coordination, at the moment, the way that he's going about it is not going to achieve that.
All right. WA, good to know. Still part of the Federation for now. We'll check in 2 weeks, Patrick Gorman. Thank you, and Jason Falinski for your time. Talk soon.